Welcome to Teaching While Crip, a disability pedagogy workshop. We're so glad that everyone could be here today to think together with us about teaching Crip, access labor, and building communities of care and support. And to begin, I'm going to go ahead and share a land acknowledgement that has been curated by the Disability Culture Group here at University of Michigan. The University of Michigan is built on the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe, the Council of the Three Fires, the Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi, as well as the Wyandot. Today, we benefit from access to land and resources originally gained through a coercive treaty that was supposed to ensure reciprocity, mutual respect, and access to education. And disability justice necessarily includes dismantling settler colonialism and white supremacy. It means dismantling the racist and ableist beliefs that the white settler body mind is the most capable and valuable. We also want to attend to accessibility before we begin here today. So we'd like to take a few moments to attend to our virtual space in particular. So first, please come to today's session as you are, and feel free to enter and exit the space as you need to. And as mentioned a moment ago, we're recording this workshop to create access for those who cannot be here. You can access CART or real-time captioning by clicking on the CC button on the bottom Zoom menu. And we also have an access copy via Google Docs available at the following URL. It's tinyurl.com/teachingcrip, and that URL will be posted in the chat throughout the event as people come and go. I also wanted to note that this event is sponsored by the DISCO Network, which receives funding from the Mellon Foundation. DISCO stands for Digital Inquiry, Speculation, Collaboration, and Optimism. And the DISCO Network integrates critical, humanistic, social science, and artistic approaches to digital studies and foregrounds questions about the cultural implications of technology to envision a new anti-racist and anti-ableist future. And you can learn more about DISCO at disconetwork.org. Pictured on the slide are photos of the co-investigators for the project, which include Lisa Nakamura, who is the lead PI, Andre Brock, Stephanie Dinkins, Rayvon Fouché, Catherine Knight Steele, and Remy Yurgo. The panelists for today's event are affiliated with the Digital Accessible Futures Lab through DISCO, and Digital Accessible Futures focuses on pressing issues at the intersections of disability justice, techno-ableism, anti-racist praxis, neuroqueer activism, and critical accessibility studies. And pictured on the slide is an image of two drawn rainbow stylized finger spelling hands, A and F, with the caption "Accessible Futures" beneath the hands. So David Edelman, who's a postdoctoral fellow in digital studies and the Digital Accessible Futures Lab at UMichigan, is now going to take a moment to introduce the panelists. Each panelist will talk for about 5 to 7 minutes, and then we're going to turn to broader discussion of everybody who's on the call. And so if you have any questions or thoughts as we go, please feel free to add them to the chat, and we'll keep a running record and return to them during discussion. So David, I will now turn things to you.
Thank you very much, Remy. I want to echo, it's wonderful to be together with all you today. So the way that I'm going to handle this introduction is to minimize any sense of awkwardness. I'm going to start with myself as I begin with A and then just proceed alphabetically. So I am a postdoctoral fellow in the Digital Accessible Futures Lab here at Michigan, and I research disability studies, Crip studies, with a particular interest on disability media studies, digital disability cultures, and so forth. I recently completed a dissertation entitled Ambivalent Pleasures, Pleasure, Desire, Authenticity, and the Production of Value in Online Disability Cultures, which looks at the discourses of desirable disability online and how they manifest in Crip cultural productions and internet publics. We also have for today Tess Krishna, who is a second-year student at the University of Michigan, the School of Nursing, and she is a research assistant through the Research Scholars Program in the Digital Accessible Futures Lab. Tess is investigating how ableism in healthcare spaces affects neurodivergent women and gender diverse people personally and in other institutional environments. Then we have Elise Stege, who is a doctoral candidate in the joint program in English and Women's and Gender Studies and a program coordinator for the Digital Accessible Futures Lab. And finally, we have Remy Hugo, who is an Arthur F. Furnow Associate Professor of Digital Studies and English at the University of Michigan. They currently direct the Digital Accessible Futures Lab as part of the DISCO network, and Remy's scholarly interests include rhetoric and writing studies, digital studies, queer rhetoric, disability studies, and neurodiversity. They currently are at work on a book project on disability, techno-rhetorics, and sociality, tentatively titled Crip Data. Thank you very much, and let us begin the panel with Tess.
Sharing the screen. Just double checking. You can only see the tab with the slides, correct? Okay. So, hello, my name is Tessa Karpner, and as you know, David just introduced me, but I am a sophomore nursing student, and I'm also a research assistant in the Digital Accessible Futures Lab. And given the topic, I think it's important for me to establish my positionality as a presenter. I am a neurodivergent student. I receive accommodations. And today I want to combine some of what I've learned through both research and also my personal experience to talk about what it's like to be a neurodivergent student. So typically I find that in the school environment, disability is very narrowly defined. So disability, though, is defined through innumerable experiences. So through my view of disability, which is informed mostly through disability studies literature, disability encapsulates any body-mind divergence from non-disability. So things like depression, anxiety, OCD, stutters, dyslexia, and much more are disabling conditions. Next, I want to loosely define the term neurodivergent. So this is an umbrella term that covers a lot of disabilities related to cognition and general neurological functioning. Some examples of these are OCD, autism, ADHD, and as you can see in this picture, many, many more. So diagnosis in this presentation will refer not only to medical diagnoses, but also self-diagnoses, which are considered to be more and more valid as society grows more aware of the inequitable ways that diagnosis is granted. Lastly, I just want to say, if you hear me refer to the SSD, I'm referring to like any educational office designed to provide services to students with disabilities. So not just at Michigan. Just to establish the population I'm talking about, I do have a couple facts here. So most disabled students do not inform their school of their disability. And we know that disclosure leads to increased use of resources and accommodation. So this is very concerning. It is important to consider the various reasons why students choose not to disclose. And a lot of times I personally see with people my age that they feel that they're not eligible or they're not worthy of accommodations. You know, they think they're at a great university, they excelled in school, they're excelling in school, and they don't feel that they qualify as being disabled. And then lastly, I have outlined some of the most commonly reported disabilities, the top three being learning disabilities, ADHD, and psychiatric disabilities. And then lastly, I wanted to talk about this accommodation drop-off. So 94% of students with learning disabilities are getting accommodations in high school, which is great. That's a lot. However, only 17% of those 94% of students with learning disabilities are continuing to receive accommodations once they move on to college. So these people are not suddenly becoming neurotypical the summer between high school and college, but their support system is changing drastically. So physical and social adaptation. Social adaptation can be very difficult for a group that can't always just like visually recognize each other. So most people do not look at me and know that I'm neurodivergent. So how are they going to be able to find shared disability community and culture with me given this barrier? Many underrepresented groups have access to bridge programs, which are very effective and helpful and help them kind of explore the different environment and meet other people, form community. However, these programs don't typically exist for disabled students. Next, we can't expect students to fully adapt to an environment that is not made for them and actively excludes them. So there's many physical inaccessibilities that might be ADA compliant, but are still not truly accessible. So you can think about the size of entrances to, say, like the showers in a dorm, or a lack of navigable street crossings for low vision people. Here, there's a picture of a chair desk, which is a really common example of phobic seating, and sensory assaults that can be difficult for neurodivergent students, like fluorescent lighting, loud background noise, high ceilings, stuff like that. Then lastly, recordings of classes are becoming more common with, the move to virtual learning and, some virtual learning that's still happening. And this is can be a really good thing in terms of students who might need to go back and review, especially from memory. And it can also be difficult for students who have trouble paying attention when not physically in like an accountable space. Also, financial issues are really common among disabled students, neurodivergent students. A lot of college student jobs are in inaccessible food service or local business areas, and many of these jobs are not physically accessible. Crip time is a term used to describe the unique relationship that disabled people have with time. An example of this is like managing health can be very time consuming and can kind of limit what a student might be able to donate their time to, whether it's volunteering or getting paid to do work. Lastly, financial aid doesn't really consider a lot of the unpaid care duties that a lot of parents of disabled students are performing without compensation. It could be like most of their kids' life. So there's that, as well as the Crip tax, which is like associated disability costs that add up over time. So next, there's a very rigid accommodation process at most schools. So some, but not all SSDs do require students to show proof of or medical proof of disability. And students typically have to write and talk and sometimes do both to speak to the SSD describing their needs. So there's a couple problematic parts of the process. First, students often wait to contact the SSD until they're struggling, their GPA has been affected before they are exploring resources. Second, access to medical diagnosis is a privilege. They can be very expensive, time consuming, and also medical diagnoses, especially for conditions like autism or ADHD, can be much harder if you're a part of oppressed social groups. So also, we talked about the accommodation drop-off earlier. Part of this is likely due to the changing role of parents. So a lot of students are fortunate enough to get their accommodations as children, and their parents may have handled a lot of the IEP or 504 paperwork, but obviously this changes when you go to college. You don't have a lot of strong self-advocacy skills. Proving yourself can feel very demeaning and be very difficult. Lastly, representation. So looking around, are there faculty and staff who are disabled? Is there a space or a center dedicated to disabled culture and belonging? And then also in general, do students feel safe disclosing? Because I can't fit everything in a 5 to 7 minute presentation, I do just want to put these resources out there in case you're interested in learning more. about day-to-day life while being disabled. Thank you so much.
David, I believe you're muted.
Yes, I apologize for that. Next, I will present. Initially, I had hoped to screen share a aesthetically pretty slide. It is still accessible with the Access copy if you want to enjoy shades of pink. But for my own access needs, I will be sticking to my face at the moment. And today I want to talk about rigor. Specifically, the underlying assumptions of that concept in academia. The word itself conjures up stereotypical images for a lot of us. It can be associated with various styles of pedagogical strategy. Perhaps most classically, the sage on the stage, this endowed expert bestowing knowledge on the expert audience. Yet disability studies and activism are more wary of top-down expertise, insofar as it works to decenter disability experience and Crip wisdom more broadly. Perhaps we should all be wary of rigor, if only because of its close association, per the OED, with suffering, hardship, and cruelty. To be clear, I do not mean to suggest in broad strokes that the appeal to rigor stems from a desire to be consciously cruel. And yet, the appeal to rigor, often imposed on instructors from forces beyond their control, has the effect of rapidly cooling and disconnecting communities of learners. As a pedagogical strategy, rigor remains trenchant in academic discourse precisely because it is an appeal to an imagined normalcy, which in turn is particularly appealing to various populations who wish to return to what was to an already mythologized pre-pandemic classroom. Yet one of the key takeaways from disability studies and disability activism is the acknowledgement that normal, as we understand it, is a construct. It is at best compacted shorthand for statistically enumerated behavior. This statistical description has been historically weighed down by cultural and social preoccupations with normalizing bodies, often to violent effects. But I think, as many of us would agree, normal is not a universal concept. Again, rigor is inextricable from a desire to return to standard operating procedure. In short, it is a distancing mechanism designed to help us forget the lived realities of educational practice. Put differently, it is a means to control the classroom, to reduce variability, and to create the illusion of stasis. But as an instructor, and I'm speaking from that pedagogical experience here, it is not my job to teach blank slates. Students come into the classroom with rich lived experiences. Rather, it is my job to establish a relationship and to provide students with an expanded array of techniques to articulate, analyze, and understand their words. Just over a year ago, Douglas Dowling, writing for the LA Review of Books, described rigor as a pose when our pedagogy is not yet born. Isn't that fabulous? Borrowing from Leonard J. Davis, I would stipulate further. Rigor might be described as a difficult pose when our pedagogy is not yet born. I firmly believe that the classroom is a community. It is a laboratory of ideas. Historically, it has either attained a place of either unnecessary criticism as a target for anti-intellectualism on the right, or as evidenced by calls for rigor, as a place for sacred and sacrosanct learning. Practically, I'm not interested here in describing what equitable learning must look like or what an accessible classroom absolutely is. After all, access is a construct. It shifts across time and space and bodies. However, from my position as an intensely disabled person living intensely interdependently with caregivers, while also being dependent on temperamental medical technologies, digital access means greater accessibility. Hybrid and virtual learning environments afford me the opportunity to be a better support for my students. No technology is universally accessible, but this is why it's useful for me to think of pedagogy as a pose, as a continually responsive relationship to an ever-altering classroom environment. And I could go on farther, but I feel as if I'm running up against time. I would just like to close by saying that much has been written about the opening up of access opportunities for people in the advent of the pandemic. That is not what I imagine this talk being about, but rather we should embrace being Crip in the classroom. What does that mean? It comes here in my use from Amy Hammerai, who says that disabled people are already experts at living in crisis. And so therefore we should work to build a responsive classroom that embraces vulnerability, that imagines that instructors can be honest with students about their needs in order to be better supportive teachers and instructors, and to imagine more equitable ways of being in community together to learn and to imagine more equitable futures. Thank you very much for your time.
Hello, everyone. This is Remy speaking. Before I talk, I'll just make a quick note. There's been some difficulty getting access to some of the links to scripts and slides in the main Google Doc that we've been sharing. We're having some challenges because it's wanting to restrict only to University of Michigan on, I think, David's in particular. So I've pasted this script to David's talk in the main Google Doc, and I put the text of David's slide in the chat. Please let us know as we keep going if any of the other docs are giving you a problem, and we'll do our best to troubleshoot. Apologies all around. I'm going to just really quickly talk about executive functioning and some of my distaste for the metaphors and stories that circulate around executive functioning. There are many academic stories about how disability moves. And when we think about how neurodivergence is storied in particular, there are a lot of institutional discourses that we might bring to mind. So key terms like preparedness or resilience or wellness, or of course, executive function or its corollary, executive dysfunction. And these stories are in many ways neoliberal workplace stories. These stories focus on fixing learners more than they do on transforming institutions. And these stories also invent disability. So through these stories, disability comes into being via individuals' supposed deficits in meeting the demands of schooling or of the workplace. The stories that attend executive dysfunction are the ones I want us to linger on because I think they're important on many levels. So first, they might help us determine newer and more complex ways of pushing back against academic ableism. Second, they prompt us to think broadly about supporting neurodivergent ways of learning, writing, and composing. And third, they can help highlight the trade-offs disabled people often have to make between receiving an accommodation and being surveilled. I didn't add a fourth in my script, but I would say the fourth is that discourse on executive function has been around for a long time, but it's most certainly increased during the pandemic, especially as we've had to engage in all kinds of new and ever more inventive modes of learning and working. So as I mentioned, executive function is decidedly neoliberal as a framework for thinking about disability. And more or less, it's frequently metaphorized as the brain's secretary. So executive function represents our supposed incapacities for managing, planning, and moving across tasks. And in this way, executive function presents a model of learning and working that is also implicated in feminized and racialized labor practices, as well as a corporatized orientation toward moving through the world. Executive function has also come to serve as a metonym, or another way of framing this is saying it's a stand-in or a substitution for a wide array of disabilities. I think what Tess had shared earlier is really indicative of this. So it's often associated with ADHD, depression, dyslexia, OCD, autism, autoimmune conditions, long COVID, and many, many, many more than I have named here. So executive dysfunction is often narrated as impacting task shifting, time management, and organizing, which are all sort of the moral goals of the academy. So right away, you can quickly understand how and why disabled folks are suddenly implicated in being lazy or immoral in terms of their approach to academic life. I should also note that executive function is a frequent narrative touchstone among neurodivergent folks on social media, and especially social media content creators. And you can find conversations typically unfolding across hashtag discourse on adulting, Spoonie Chat, or Neurodiverse Squad, among other places. And perhaps not surprisingly, the tenor of stories unfolding across social media often diverge from the clinical stories we encounter of what it means to experience time and work as a neurodivergent person. So I'm going to really briefly get into some of the common clinical representations of executive function, because typically EF is storied across 3 domains: working memory, cognitive flexibility, and inhibition. And notably, these representations are generally situated in a rehabilitative or pathological understanding of disability. So working memory points toward the ways in which we hold. That is our means of holding attention, our means of storing and retrieving those items in which we mean to direct our attention, as well as our inclinations to return to something we've been holding on to for a while. So for example, writing on a semester timeline generally requires us to hold and to return to any number of items at a really unsettling frequency, difficulties that have been deeply compounded by COVID fog. And normative expectations for working memory are deeply individualistic, where to imagine working memory as supposedly being ours and ours alone. But I think, as anybody knows, as a writer, a learner, a teacher, surely we know that these assessments simply just are not how writing or writers or learning or teaching generally work. These are the corporate timelines of the academy. Cognitive flexibility, another executive function domain, really doesn't sound great in its inverse. Who among us wishes to be called cognitively inflexible? Like, I literally have that on a piece of paper about me somewhere. As with working memory, the supposed capacities that attend flexibility cluster around institutional values concerning multitasking. Think Jay Dolmage, whose last name is spelled Dolmage, talks about this as being multimodal all the time. So it's like an all the things kind of approach to academic life. It also represents the ability to supposedly adapt to novel situations. And the sticky thing about cognitive flexibility is it presumes that all learners are or should be predisposed to move at a certain speed on a certain timeline. That is, institutions demand flexibility from their learners and their workers without demonstrating reciprocity. So the institution will not be flexible, but of course the institution is the pinnacle of executive function. Lastly, inhibition, that designation, is one place where I hope we might begin from a strategic neurodiversity-oriented standpoint toward executive function. And let's see, I think there might be some crosstalk. Okay, cool. So inhibition, I think we can clearly glean how and why framing neurodivergent students as being impulsive or uninhibited is deeply ableist. And more than drawing upon long-standing stigmas concerning learning disabilities and what have been conventionally called mental illnesses, inhibition suggests that regulation is the solution to the challenges that confront us. So it's yet more corporate speak in terms of how we're thinking about working with neurodivergent colleagues and students. One thought is, rather than interpret inhibition as an always negative, it might prompt us to consider the ways in which embracing urges rather than ignoring them can in fact at times be an asset in our classrooms. And the puppy is agreeing. So this is where I'm going to leave off, and this is sort of a half-baked thought on digital secretaries. So if executive function is considered the brain's secretary, is it any wonder that digital assistants and related tools have been proffered as a cure-all to fill the supposed cranial voids of neurodivergent folks? And as someone who is executively dysfunctional, I routinely receive well-meaning but misinformed comments that my problems will be solved if I just use Google Calendar better or Writer, or if I were to dump all my mental baggage onto Alexa, or if I were to download the Timo app, or if I were to purchase an Apple Watch, so on and so forth. And in talking with a fellow neurodivergent person earlier today, they reflected how others often told them that making a detailed Excel grid would solve their ADHD. I'm not suggesting that digital tools are never helpful. Rather, I'm dismayed by how frequently higher ed's attempts toward neurodivergent inclusivity is to buy a subscription to an app. It also very unproblematically regards the whole corporate framework of digital assistants as always being a net positive. This approach also comes at the expense of systems level reimagining. Instead of thinking what it might mean to reimagine deadlines or the semester timeline or to do away with academic probation, instead it's go talk to Siri. I also just want to emphasize in closing that this approach to a digital patchwork accommodation system for executive function also really reinforces the moralizing of educational norms, right? Because the inverse interpretation is if you cannot do this on this timeline in this way, that somehow you are not completing your moral duty to the institution. So I will stop here.
Hi, everybody. So this is Elise speaking, and I'm hoping to talk today just about sort of personal examples of teaching while Crip and some things that have worked for me when it comes to trying to navigate meeting my own access needs as much as possible while also meeting students' access needs, especially in the wake of some kind of ongoing conversations about particularly extensions and how, as instructors, extensions can sort of cause a burden for us as instructors, and also in the context of a lot of institutions, especially within the last few months, but really the last year and a half and right from the beginning of the pandemic, even sort of encouraging instructors to, rather than using the new context that we find ourselves in as an opportunity to explore access collaboratively, to sort of prioritize their own comfort over students' access needs. So in the context of all of that, I would like to talk about a class that I taught last year. It was entirely remote, and it was an upper level English class, and the topic was self-representation and disability justice. So it was a particularly, I think, opportune moment to really talk with students about access and incorporate that into sort of the content of the course to navigate our access needs together. And some things, I think sometimes I'm going to slip into sort of the language of like, you can do this, but really I'm just reflecting my own experience. It's not meant to be prescriptive. So some things that I want to focus on are sort of what it means to be really aware of your own access needs, the way that you can model your own access needs as a way to teach students that theirs are also important rather than seeing those needs as competing or in conflict. And then specifically ways that I did that in that course that seemed to work really well in terms of not abandoning my own access needs, and also based on feedback that I got from students seemed like a really effective way to sort of meet the learning objective of understanding what access can be and what interdependence can be and sort of all of that. So thinking first about just being aware of one's own access needs, I feel like there have been a lot of times when I think I am trying to meet my own access needs and I'm really not acknowledging what they are to begin with. And in my experience, that can be one of those things that creates the sense that there's conflict or tension between my needs and students' needs, rather than sort of seeing that the problem is the institutional expectations on instructors and students. So first of all, just being very honest about sort of like what works for me, what doesn't work for me, whether or not I feel like I should be able to read and comment on X amount of pages, and if that's really something that I can do, or other ways that I can sort of navigate that and all of that. Then thinking about modeling the act of prioritizing my own access needs, something that I see happening in conversations with colleagues and that I've experienced, right, is this sense that our needs are in conflict with our students. And I think that that sense of, again, sort of resentment or defensiveness can come from the sense that you really want to meet your students' needs. And also, if you're totally disregarding your own, you can't even really try to do that. And so I think a few things are really key in that. First of all, for me, letting go of the sense that I'm going to create some kind of mythical perfect access, because that's not possible. And I think that's very different from some of the institutional messaging that we've got about how, because that's not possible, you should just kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater and not try to work towards access in your courses. I think it also has been really helpful to think about which boundaries and expectations I have as an instructor are really protecting my own access needs and trying to enable access, and which are preferences that could be squishier or renegotiated. And in modeling that for my students, I have seen students then be able to better advocate for themselves and better understand sort of even the process of figuring out what works for you and then figuring out how to communicate that. This often means that students might be encountering less content around sort of disability studies in terms of things that we're reading, watching, but they're also really deeply engaging with it. So like if we read about, I think, for example, one of the things that we read in that course was by Mia Mingus and was about interdependence, right? So we read that and then they actually get to experience what it looks like in the classroom to have to collaboratively work with their peers and with me to come up with sort of group agreements around access. And so it seems very worth it to me to kind of balance that a little differently. And kind of going back to what David was talking about with rigor, I think that that's one of the sort of common places that critique that accessible things are not rigorous comes in. And I think that like we can think much more expansively about that, right? And we can think about how modeling these things actually do create deeper engagement and more critical thinking, like David was talking about. So I feel like I'm coming up on time quicker than I had thought I would, but just some sort of nuts and bolts ways that this worked for me. I use a lot of surveys, make those surveys mostly about community building and sort of reflecting on, in terms of group projects, what roles you like, what are your absolute, deal breakers, will not take on this role in a group project, what your experiences have been with group projects, etc., what access things you're aware of that you need, sort of like checking in, and then building the sense of, sorry, I'm trying to prioritize time-wise and I need to give my brain 1 second. So prioritizing students' engagement as something that is part of credit for the course, right? So that it's not that these things are ancillary or that it's a favor that I'm asking them to do to a sort of a precondition to engaging with the course, but that is the course, that part of what we're doing is negotiating those things together. So that's one thing I do. We also have collaborative agreements, both about group work and about sort of the wider course, what we expect from each other. And weekly reflections specifically about collaboration have also been really helpful. And I think they give an example of sort of how easy sometimes making things more accessible can be. So for example, I have students check in each week when they're doing group work. Some of the questions in those check-ins are, who did you especially appreciate this week? Who seemed less present this week? And right up front, I tell them that that's not so that they, can police each other or throw each other under the bus, or that I'm using that in a putative way, but in order to be aware of sort of who might be needing more support and then following through on that. And that alone does wonders in terms of students feeling like they can be more honest about not being able to show up as fully as they would like to, or worrying about group members without it feeling like they are like betraying their classmates and colleagues. I think the final thing I want to talk about is also just a sort of practical example of using flexibility and how flexibility can be something that both enables access for students and enables access for us as instructors. So one of the things that I did with this course is I gave students the option, I think every time that they had an assignment like this, where they could collaboratively discuss, the given things on a worksheet with prompts that I had given them, and submit a written worksheet that reflected that discussion, or they could submit an audio recording of that discussion or a video recording. Since they were all on Zoom, it was remote. And this is one of those things that seems, I think I've heard from other instructors that they couldn't imagine like watching back an entire Zoom discussion, right? And if you have multiple groups of students, that seems very time intensive and all of that. And that's one of those things that actually for me is much more accessible than reading, 6 or 7 of the same like multi-page worksheet. And I tend to focus better if I'm listening to things at 1.5 speed. So realizing that I could have students submit video recordings if they wanted to of their discussions, and that I could engage with them in a much more focused and effective way. And that also it didn't need to take, if they were discussing something for an hour, it didn't need to actually take me an hour to go through that discussion with them, is something that I think towards the beginning of my experience teaching, I would not have let myself consider. And those kind of small granular things have been really helpful in prioritizing both my access needs and students without getting sort of sucked into this false dichotomy of we can either meet our own needs as instructors or try to work with students to meet their access needs. So thank you.
Thank you, Elise and David and Tess. This is Remy speaking again. So I'm going to ask us to pause for a moment. We're going to transition into discussion. We're going to primarily use the chat feature to engage in discussion, but we'll also use the hand raise feature as time allows to engage in discussion as well. What we wanted to do was to pause for 2 minutes just to give people some time to digest and formulate questions, or if you need to exit gracefully, that 2-minute window can also serve that purpose as well. For my part, I'm going to briefly screen share a timer that also has a bunch of ads on it. So apology for all of the ads, but we'll just kind of do a countdown effect for 2 minutes, and then we'll regroup and engage in conversation. All right, this is Remy speaking again. So we have had 2 minutes, and so I'll just sort of re-narrate. If you have any questions or comments that you'd like to put forth for discussion, please feel free to enter them in the chat. You can also use the hand raise function in Zoom, which should appear at the bottom of your screen. Mine is bundled under the reactions button. And Eric and Jessica will help us to sort of collate questions as they come in as well. And it looks like we have a question, I believe, from Shanna.
Hi, yeah, sorry, I couldn't type as fast as I wanted to ask. So I teach our pedagogy class in the School of Social Work. And I often have these conversations with my students as a disabled and neurodivergent faculty member myself. And the students always bring up, though, that existing within capitalist, ableist, cishet, patriarchal, white supremacist academy spaces means that they are still graded as GSIs or as instructors under these very ableist notions of performing as instructors. When they go on the job market, telling people that they believe in ungrading or creating universal design for learning may be looked down upon. How would you give feedback to emerging scholars on how to have an anti-ableist pedagogy for themselves and for their students without being penalized career-wise?
I don't know, David or Elise, if either of you wanted to start.
I'll go ahead and start. This is something that I wrestle with myself, as Shanna knows. I have had conversations about upgrading and what that looks like. And to be frank, I am in a privileged position in that the courses that I teach are housed here at the University of Michigan in the Digital Studies Institute, and that they are very much supported, and that the pedagogic goals, I feel that I can make these arguments in the place that I currently am. My advice for new applicants, right, is it's all about, specifically when I was writing for this position, I put it explicitly in my teaching philosophy that I believed in disability justice and in inclusive teaching practices that go beyond inclusive teaching to the disability justice piece, because we all recognize, or it's common sort of parlance in online discourse, that disability inclusion is not the same thing as disability justice. And so in that regard, it was something of a self-selection. So I will speak, again, this is from my perspective, that it always has to do with being smart in selecting the schools that you apply to. And admittedly, you know, we all have different circumstances for why we apply to some place. But for instance, me, I knew that I could not do a shotgun approach of applying to 33 different places, because I might get into like 10, but then traveling with a complex wheelchair and a complex disability is incredibly difficult. And so it was all about being very selective in the programs that I went to, and being very clear as well with my needs, both as an instructor and with my pedagogical vision. And while it may have been meant that I had to be more selective and to wait around, the jobs are there. It just, you cannot hold yourself to another academic's job journey, in my experience, because I have peers who did exactly that, applied to 33 different jobs and got 10 and were wooed by different things. And that was not my experience. And so it's all, that is how I come to the position that I am today, and I hope that that is helpful to you.
I don't know if this will be particularly helpful, but just speaking from my own experience, I am not planning on going on the academic job market, partially because of the ways in which teaching that centers and tries to enact disability justice is like not valued broadly in academia. So not to sort of have it be a everything is bleak for the students that you are also trying to help and advocate for, but I think just reflecting the reality that, like, yes, that is an ongoing problem, and that there isn't really one, like, there are all of these strategies that we can use, right, but there still is the reality that disabled academics, including grad students, are essentially kind of being shoved out all the time. So.
And this is Remy speaking, just to sort of really quickly add on to what Elise and David are saying. I think part of the challenge is that you'll always be operating from, in many ways, an advocacy position, and in many ways a disempowered position. But partly what this involves is really being constant on it, and you do constantly, in response, get hostility or doubt. I think it goes back to what David was noting about accessibility somehow being equated with not being rigorous. You know, there are some thoughts. So depending on, the discipline you're in, the department you're in, the institutional context you're in, as a graduate student instructor, sometimes you have more flexibility with the design of your curriculum, and sometimes you don't. It's literally handed to you. I know some approaches people have taken is to add on to the boilerplate. So like they'll use the boilerplate they're given, and then they'll just do a lot of writing and thinking around it. So finding the little nooks and crannies where you can make the course your own and try to think really attentively to some of these questions that people have been bringing up. There are other instances too where I hesitate to necessarily call it like a shadow syllabus or a shadow curriculum, but thinking about what people are doing in the underlife of their classes. And so there's what's on paper, and then there's what's happening day to day in those spaces as well, which can be opportunities for being inventive. But it's really, really hard work. Like, to give an example, like when I went up for my third year review, I was strongly encouraged to attend a grade norming workshop. And like, just even the phrase grade norming made me feel like a bunch of slime had been dumped on top of me. So I think it's particularly pernicious. And then wanting to attend to questions in the chat, because a few have come in. So I'm going to do my best to just kind of go in order a little bit here. So I'll just start with a question from Helen that says, what disability pedagogy considerations do you recommend for new course development, especially in a course by and for disabled people? And so I don't know if any of my fellow co-panelists have thoughts on this question.
I have a thought. And also, hi, Helen. So I think, like, the way that I have navigated this that has worked well for me is really, really making things collaborative while also providing sort of parameters and scaffolding so that students aren't like left to flounder if they feel like they don't know what I'm asking of them, right? Encouraging people to really, like, in the class, to build the class in a way that lets everyone participating build those practices like with you, and the kind of content even sometimes that they want to see with you, within the framework of like as the person building this course, I've got you if you don't really know like what you want to share in this moment. So like having multiple times to do that, having that be a built-in process, and that can be really straightforward. So.
And also, if I could add on to what Elise has said, for me, because a lot of my experience is in taking courses that don't have a disability focus and sort of making the class more or less about that, because again, it's my research interest and my lived experience as a disabled person, what is very important to me, and I don't think gets talked about enough, although Elise did talk about it in their presentation, which is that having a discussion very early on about community agreements and being okay with revisiting that, and sort of having a conversation about how do we want to handle discussion in this way, but also being open to not putting people on the spot. So in practice, what this often looks like is I will introduce the topic at the end of a class and then send out an online survey. And then that way someone can respond without being necessarily associated with the comment if they feel like disclosing or not, and then coming back at the beginning of the next class and taking the takeaways and having a discussion about what has come up has been very useful for me.
So I'm gonna move to the next question from CJ, which says, from a perspective of chronic disability and physical disability, what are some tools or strategies we can use to introduce students to our needs as teachers, but also introduce teachers to our needs as students? For example, I am diabetic, and explaining needing to take a break for a low blood sugar to my students was tough in the moment. As a student in an online program, I'm nervous to ask for extensions or accommodations from my professors due to lost time due to episodes of low and high blood sugar and the cognitive and physical impacts that happen afterwards in the days leading up to a deadline.
Contribute a bit here in my experience with, you know, what has made me felt as a student, like confident about a professor's willingness to accommodate me and provide like accessible instruction. On the first day of my like biostatistics course, one of the first things my professor said was like, even if you don't have registered accommodations right now, I want you to know that I want to help you. And it wasn't like, I want you to come talk to me right now, or I want you to come talk to me after class, I want you to raise your hand. He was just like, however you feel you can tell me about that. Like, I will tell you that this is something that I want to prioritize. I think that also in another class I had in School of Nursing, a professor had mentioned also the idea of like, you do not need to have a medical diagnosis. This is something that we can talk about together. Getting registered with the SSD. And additionally, like, I think that there's some worry about students abusing this, but, you know, like as an instructor, like I was using it with best judgment, obviously, but I also had instructors say, if you have any sort of like, you know, medical emergency or something like that, my priority is that, you know, you are able to recover. And I think that made me much more likely to approach the instructor about, you know, I'm having some like, you know, like a flare up and I need a little bit of extra time. In terms of the other way around, I haven't had a lot of teachers who would come forward or like, you know, kind of let their students know about maybe like a chronic condition, but I feel like there's a lot of value in doing that for students who are disabled or neurodivergent and seeing the representation and their professors as well. So that's all I can kind of say from the instructor side, but.
And this is Remy speaking. I can maybe respond following what Tess was sharing as well from an instructor side. I think it's really challenging. So one of the first things I might recommend if you haven't had a chance to do so yet, is to figure out who your people are. So who might serve as an advocate or a mentor who you know would be a more receptive person to talk with and strategize, especially in terms of the particularities of your institution or your program. I know for me, in terms of that question of, disclosure, like thinking about how to introduce your needs, it's, I think for many people, lifelong. It's been lifelong for me. I don't think that I'm 100% good at it, but I do know it feels better and different now than it did for me when I first started teaching. Because when I first started teaching, I would immediately share that I was autistic with students, and that would result in getting course evals at the end of term that said things like, "I'm mildly insulted. My instructor has a communication disorder and is teaching me how to communicate," and that kind of stuff. Over time, I've been really intentional about weaving it into how I teach the class, so that my introduction of my own identity or needs is specifically tied to how can we create a more welcoming or inclusive environment in class, which I don't think I was quite doing when I first started trying to disclose. I think it's also kind of how I disclose and try to get my needs met or think about my own accommodations as an instructor has also morphed as my own teaching persona has morphed. I just know when you first start teaching, often there's a lot of conversation of your persona in the classroom, which I initially didn't understand because I'm like, I'm one human. But now I think I do understand it. And so I would describe my teaching persona as awkward joke central. And I just sort of like bend into how awkward I am in a way that kind of works. And that's obviously not a strategy for everyone, but I think it's trying to hone in on like, how do you want to relate to the other people in your classroom, and to try and build things in that way has been helpful for me personally. Other people's mileage may vary with that. So I'm going to move to the next question, if that sounds okay, and maybe for all four of us fellow panelists, we can aim for one or two of us to respond to each question. We'll kind of bounce around. So this question comes from Sarah, and I'll just begin with the first question, and then we can kind of move and see what time allows. So this was so helpful for me, and I have so many questions. I don't intend for all of these to be taken up, but if any speaker or attendee finds them provocative, I'd love to hear your thoughts. So the first question is how to match Crip rhythms to the semester. For example, weekly reflections make sense given a weekly class schedule, but how does this work when people might need to do these reflections after the class meeting instead? How do people negotiate this, particularly as smaller, shorter assignments might be more accessible for some students, but overwhelming for others?
I can jump in on this one. So this was a little bit different because the course that I was teaching, where I had them do a lot of weekly reflections, was a remote and mostly asynchronous course. They would meet as small groups on Zoom together, but we very rarely met as a whole class together. So, and they would know, I let them know up front that this was a thing that we would be doing each week, that they had a discussion assignment, and it was built into our online learning platform that they could see each week when the reflection was coming. They had a whole week to do it. And it genuinely was, I think, 4 questions. And I asked them to write a sentence or 2 for each question. So I think sometimes when you talk about reflections, it can seem like it has to be this whole involved thing, and there's this pressure for it to take a certain form. And getting rid of a lot of those assumptions with my students really helped make this both like less overwhelming for students who don't gel with having multiple small assignments, which I also don't gel with that. So it's like, how can we make this not something that's just constant and often falls through the cracks? And I think knowing upfront what the expectation was of it will be these 4 questions, you just need to write a couple sentences. That was how I negotiated that. And so there wasn't the expectation that they were doing it in a specific like space in the classroom or a specific time. And just generally with the sort of question of a lot of smaller assignments, the question of like rhythm and being able to anticipate it actually has been huge in my own teaching. Again, like as a student, I was someone who did not like having sort of regular check-ins or 7 things in a week that I needed to keep track of rather than like one project that took several weeks. But building that in a way where it becomes really like integral to the course and letting them know at the very beginning that that's what's happening and that it will be sort of similar throughout, I think based on feedback from students really helped them. And I don't know, that's how it's worked for me. So
to just add on to what Elisa said, this is David. So for myself, 2 things have really helped me. One, so as I mentioned earlier, begin the class with a community agreement sort of thing. And generally in that agreement, there is a clause that says that at the middle of the semester, or generally the middle of the semester, there will be a check-in, which is not the only time students can talk to me, obviously, but it's an opportunity to check in with the class at large. Again, I like surveys. I like digital surveys because it provides anonymity and a space for people to talk. And so at that point, I ask them generally of like, what is working? What did you like about the class? What isn't working? And what would you suggest that we do to change it? And you get some really fascinating responses because on the one hand, you have students who are like, well, I just don't want to do this kind of assignment anymore. And if you have a whole bunch of students telling you that that's one thing, but if you have someone who's thoughtful and wants to engage in the material, but just isn't feeling like they can do that in the current form, often you get brilliant responses back about that. But also, I, just being completely honest, have not historically done a lot of small assignments, purely because for my own access needs, it can get frustrating to respond back immediately. But what I often do is I will structure assignments so that they build on one another. And so at that point, if students were okay with this one thing and then suddenly start having trouble, then you can sort of pinpoint that it happened at this point in the semester, which allows you to be attentive in your own class.
I also wanted to add just like 2 kind of formats of assignment things that I've like seen in classes that I think were specifically made to be accessible. One, in a class like 3 big main assignments, there were like different sort of formats of the assignment that accomplished the same goal, but in a different format. So you could write like a 3-page paper, or you could do some sort of multimodal representation of the same topic, but like communicating in a different way. And if you did choose like a non-traditional way, you know, not like a 3-page paper, you just submit like a short proposal. And I don't know, for me, that ended in like probably one of my favorite assignments I've ever like done in school. But that was one thing that I really appreciated as a student. And another one, I don't know how realistic this is for different courses. They did have like a points-based course where there was just like a ton of different kind of assignments you could choose to do. And some of them were mandatory, but like many of the smaller assignments you could choose based on like, you know, the mode that like each was presented in. So I feel like then I was able to choose assignments that were most accessible to me in terms of like how I communicate information best. But then again, I know that that's got to be different for different courses. So.
And this is Remy speaking again. I'm going to turn to the second second question from Sarah, and then turn to the next question in the chat, because I think this question follows up on what folks were saying earlier, and that is, how does or must the instructor's disclosure relate to this idea of Crip teaching? It sounded really important in several presentations. So I don't know if folks have thoughts on that relationship between disclosure and Crip teaching in particular.
This is David. I can sort of jump in here. which is that I move through the world in a very Crip fashion, in the regard that I have a very visible disability. I use complex medical technology. And so for me, I think of it less as disclosure and more as advocating for myself. And now I completely understand that I am living in a particularly situated position. I have a physical disability. It is very visible. Someone else might see it different or see their relationship to their disability differently, but I've always believed that to be disabled in public is a political move. And so, and this of course applies in my mind to all disability, but so for me, it's less of a conscious choice to be like, okay, this is the moment in which I am going to reveal a portion of my life, and more of thinking about what we have traditionally told about pedagogy in pedagogy classes. Because part of my interest in pedagogy is like, how do I do this in a way that makes sense to my body? Because like historically, I've been told things like move around the classroom, use the whiteboard, do think, pair, share, be able to get up close to your students. And I'm like, excuse my language, I'm fucked because I cannot do this kind of thing. And so it's about reimagining the space in a way that is equitable for me. But at the same time, I don't necessarily think that it is absolutely dependent that you have a disability. Primarily for me, when I'm thinking about what it means to be Crip and to teach Crip in the classroom, it's to imagine very simply, one, that all of your students are the most vulnerable that they could possibly be. And how would you design a class around that? And then for me personally, unless someone discloses differently to me, I assume that all of my students are disabled because it just helps me. Now, this does not mean that I want to speak to someone's life experience, but it is a commitment to creating access, which will never be perfect. Multiple of us have talked about this, but it's a commitment to thinking outside of the able-bodied, white sexual subject position.
So as a person who, none of my various like chronic illnesses and things going on are particularly like legible to students in an immediate way. And I think thinking about, like, there's so much to think about with disclosure, but one of the ways that I've navigated this is, instead of kind of in conversation with what Remy was talking about too, instead of telling students sort of like, I have this or I am this, that I tend to sort of bake it into like practical examples. So when I'm talking with them about extensions and encouraging them to ask for extensions and explaining that like their work won't be held to higher standards if they have an extension, and that I won't, count it against them mentally in some way if they ask for an extension. I also usually say, here are some reasons that I as a student had asked for extensions. So it might be like not being able to get out of bed, or not being able to read because I have a migraine, or needing to take care of family members or whatever. And like giving those examples has navigated that in a way where students respond usually by then seeing that like the actual things that are going on in their lives and with their bodies are good enough reasons to like ask for extensions or XYZ, rather than it's sort of like in times when I have used more sort of diagnostic language with students, it often then it creates more distance between us in that moment, rather than the sort of like, oh yes, this is relevant to you too, and you can be a full human here. So like, of course, that's super problematic as like a phenomenon in the world. And that's one of the ways that I've navigated disclosure, when I didn't want to just say, here's this diagnostic category that I fall under. So.
And this is Remy speaking, just to echo Elise, because I think one of the ways I like to think about this also is that our body minds are always disclosing something, whether or not that something is legible as disability or another descriptor that a person might insert. But that disclosure is sort of the stories we tell, right? So like if our body minds are always disclosing, then what stories do we want to tell about our body minds? And so it can be as little or much as you desire. I think I had challenges as a new teacher in telling students I was autistic because that was the beginning and end of the story. So the only cultural knowledge they had to then draw upon was whatever they had encountered about autism before, which at that point was probably from the Student Autism Speaks chapter and other representations on television. So there's that. And I still do tell students that I'm autistic or neurodivergent, but it usually is under a more human circumstances, in the sense of not that saying I'm autistic is somehow saying I'm not human, but more in the sense of trying to ground it like Elise is suggesting and like sharing one's humanity with others in the class. And so, thinking about again the stories we tell about the classes that we're building, the relationships we're also building with one another in that space, I think is where it becomes particularly useful. Before I accidentally say other random bizarre things like comparing autisticness to humanness, I will stop talking off the cuff and move to another question. And so Megan had posed this question, I believe had to leave, but I think it's worthwhile bringing forth, even though there's been active conversation in the chat. And that is, as someone who is relatively new to the university, I wonder if there's an existing group that builds community around these topics. And so folks in the chat have been mentioning the disability culture at group and the Council for Disability Concerns, as well as the Disability Nursing Association, which isn't just for nursing students. There's also UMinds, which is the University of Michigan Initiative in Disability Studies as well. And so I don't know if folks have other thoughts here in terms of community building, whether at University of Michigan or even external to University of Michigan. We could also name Disco as one example, the convener of this event. And I will also note, just as my brain is going, at U of M, it was previously called the Student Idea Board, which was a rather large committee that was convening recommendations for U of M in the short term around disability inclusion, but there's still some activity going around that group. There's also a newly formed disability studies instructor group that I just created a listserv for. So we're using the word instructor very, very broadly. So inclusive of students and staff who are interested in teaching disability studies as well. So please feel free to direct message me your email address if you'd like me to add you to that. But I know we are coming up on time. We probably have time for one more question if anyone would like to ask one. So I'll just do an awkward pause to make sure. Thanks to folks who are messaging me their emails in the chat. I'm going to save the chat so that I have your email addresses. So just Remy verbally confirming that I've got your emails. And so I guess as we come to a close here, I know that it might be helpful to just quickly note some upcoming events, and I might turn to Tess for a moment, who's just going to plug an event that has an in-person component, but then a few weeks later, a virtual component. So for those who are not at U of M, if you're interested, there'd be an opportunity to attend that one as well.
Yeah, so this is especially cool, if you're an instructor at U of M, if you would be interested in sharing this with any students that you know, We're going to have a disability and neurodiversity party through the DSI, and there are posters around campus about it, and it'll also be on the school website. So it's open to any students of any, level, like undergrad, grad. And it's not only a social event to meet other disabled or neurodivergent students, but also to learn about courses that relate to disability studies and just like other groups that can provide some like sense of belonging. So that will be on November 10th from 1 to 3 p.m. in the Digital Study Institute space.
And this is Remy speaking. I'm going to quickly copy and paste, as Tess was describing, the info for the in-person one, which, as Tess had mentioned, is November 10th from 1 to 2. And then the online one, which will have more information forthcoming about how to register, is taking place on December 1st from 1 Eastern to 2 p.m. So I will just sort of conclude by saying thank you to everyone and for this discussion. We really appreciate the conversation and thank you for coming. And I hope everybody has a good rest of their week and has a good Friday.
Does anyone want to see my Zoom pumpkin I've been embroidering?
Oh my gosh, that's beautiful.
Thank you. My stimming.
We're gonna need this at the end of every meeting where you're working, just a progress update.
I think this might be the last time the pumpkin is here. So like there will be a wintry thing next, but thank you for caring about my pumpkin.